Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar from May. And it's on subject of organizational flexibility. So I'm Rob Robson. I'm the Director of People Science here at the People Experience Hub. And my guest is Annie Gascoigne. Annie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Rob. So I'm an organizational psychologist. I'm a trainer, facilitator, consultant, and coach. My background goes quite a juicy long way, starting off working with Rob in management consultancy far too many years ago. My focus for the first sort of 12 or so years of my career was around process and IT change. And most of that was in big multinationals. But I also did some work with some tiny little startups as well. And it was fascinating work and lots of really dedicated people trying to be as effective as we possibly could for our organizations. But something I felt that I was noticing across all of these situations was no matter how effective we were trying to be for ourselves and for our organizations, we weren't always doing that, and certainly not in a healthy way. I certainly experienced burnout for myself and saw that happening around me. And I thought there's something about human behavior here. And so that led me to look at organizational psychology. I did a master's and found some fascinating stuff, particularly around personal psychological flexibility as a healthy way of behaving. And I really wanted to get into that and understand how we could look at that in our organizations, and somehow with that got sucked into doing a PhD. So I wrote a PhD on organizational flexibility, and since then I've come out the other end and been trying to communicate this in the wider world.
Brilliant. And you know, we obviously share we share some real similarities in terms of our path. I didn't do the PhD, but you know, I, like you, spent a lot of time in very large organizations, and you know, a lot of my career has been around change, organizational change. And you know, I got to a point about it would be about 10 years ago, really, maybe 9, where I just had enough of doing, you know, large scale transformation programs that didn't really transform anything. And when we talk about change, an awful lot of the commentary is that people are the problem. And you know, people talk about resistance to change and all that sort of stuff. And I come from a very different perspective. You know, and as we've talked about before, Annie, you know, I very much come from a point of view with my psychology that we are inherently adaptable. We are inherently flexible, but things get in the way. And you know, I think, you know, so for me, I had this watershed moment that I just thought, you know, the people aren't the issue here, and we're running around trying to try harder, you know, to sort of do, you know, to kind of convince people that we should change to you know, putting more and more into change management and stuff. And actually, we're not laying the foundations, you know, in terms of the organization for it. And you know, it is to a certain extent, I think, it's a bit about mindset at an individual level, but it's more than that, isn't it? It's an awful lot more than that. And I think that's where, you know, your organizational flexibility comes in, but I'm not an expert on it. And you are. So, you know, so tell us, so let's start off with, you know, what do we actually mean by organizational flexibility? You know, how does it manifest itself? You know, what are the differences between that, you know, individual psychological flexibility and organizational flexibility, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for that. I think there's an intuitive piece around organizational flexibility, that for an organization to survive, to thrive across situations over the short term and the long term, the organization needs to be able to respond to what we know is an ever-changing context. we can recognize that what worked yesterday doesn't necessarily work today, and that might not work tomorrow. I think we've seen this play out in such a tangible way with COVID, haven't we? That what worked pre-COVID, suddenly things had to change a lot during COVID. And now maybe that doesn't work. Neither of those maybe work. What does work now, and trying to figure that stuff out. And so I think there's this gut feeling about what flexibility might mean, this need to adapt, this need to be agile. But I'm playing around with words there, and I'm not rigidly attached to the word flexibility. And I want to make sure that when I'm using that, I'm clear about what I'm talking about. What I don't see it as is a need to change constantly. It's not about we have to change with every change in the context. Mm-hmm. It's about flexibility of choice, whether with the changes that are going on to adapt, whether to keep going, whether to stay still, whether to do what we used to do, whether to do what that other organization is doing. I'm trying to connect that to, is this helpful? Is this working for doing what matters in this organization, given the environment that we're in, internally, externally, in this situation?
That's an interesting point, because I think there's a paradox, isn't there, that to be flexible, you also have to be kind of strong and structured, and if you just, you know, completely flexible without any choice and control of that, you flip-flop, and that's also not particularly healthy.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we get into these sort of chaotic patterns of continuous change, that we must be adapting all the time, and we don't necessarily tether that to something. And so I think for me, there's something really important about tethering ourselves with where we are in this moment and what matters to us. What is it that this organization is about, and are we working in line with that, given the current situation, given what we have in our organization and around our organization in this moment?
So that sort of plays to, you know, vision and purpose, you know, having something at your core.
Yeah, absolutely. I think purpose is such a core element of this. And recognizing that when we're doing stuff that matters, when we're trying to pursue purposeful things, that inevitably it feels uncomfortable, that there's a risk, an inherent risk, isn't there, that this is so important. Oh, what if it fails? What if I mess up? What if we mess up? What if we don't get it right? And recognizing that part of behaving with flexibility is acknowledging that things are uncomfortable is I think it's so vital, because it helps us to think about what behaviors we need to reinforce in order to maintain that flexibility, because it's going to be so easy for us in trying to pursue flexibility to go, oh, this is uncomfortable, and actually end up being just as rigid as we ever were to try and get some control back.
So, you know, when you talk about things like behavior, there's obviously that individual, you know, human element. So how does it play? How does that individual versus organizational kind of aspect play out? And what the differences between, you know, being flexible as an individual and being flexible as an organization?
Yeah, I think this is such a key piece. And yeah, as I was saying earlier, when I got into this idea of psychological flexibility was so important. And the way that we look at that is very much this sort of similar imagery that I was playing with before. With what I have now within me, what are my skills, what are my strengths, what are the, you know, challenges that I have within me, and what have I got, what resources and what things have I got around me right now for doing what matters to me. And when we're behaving with those in line with what matters to us, pursuing our values, even with some of that uncomfortable stuff, recognizing that we're not in exactly the right place, what can my next step be? So that can be really healthy and effective for us as individuals. And really, we're playing with that at a larger scale for the organization. For the organization, we're trying to do that as a collective, noticing the things that matter for the organization, what's going on around it and within it. And I think there's something really interesting that I started to explore here, is that relationship between what matters to me and what matters to the organization. I think my initial instinct was, hey, everybody in this organization, their values have to align with the organization's. That has to be some kind of tethered together thing to make this all line up. But what I've come to see over time is the need for a lot more flexibility around that. So I kind of have this imagery, and I don't know if, tell me if this lands for you, but if I often use the imagery of a compass setting to, and I know that when you've had conversations over these last few months on these other recordings, actually I think it was with Nick and Perry's conversation, they were talking about a North Star, and I really like that imagery, that it's up there and guiding us. So if we think about an organization having its North Star, and we're trying to get everybody moving in that direction, but I think what we can do is to get everybody entrenched in that direction. We're trying to get everybody tightly marching that way because it feels controlled and clear, when actually if we think everybody is where they are at, we can't do anything about that. Whatever their starting point is, all of our employees are wherever they are at. And what's their compass setting? It doesn't necessarily need to be tightly aligned. Some are going to be heading in a slightly northwest direction, but for the period of time that they're with the organization, they're helping it move in that northerly direction. And at some point they'll leave and pass on their way to work somewhere else when that is less helpful for them and the organization. And I think that can be a really useful way of thinking about the diversity of perspectives within an organization, that we've got people moving around within a broader perspective. Does that land for you?
Yeah, that works. I like that. I mean, you know, it's that plays to values, but it also talks to strategy, doesn't it? And the overall sort of vision. You know, it's are we moving towards something? We might not know exactly what the next step needs to be, and that's not necessarily going to be dictated to us, but we know we're heading broadly in the right direction, and we'll correct our course if we need to. I think there's the whole thing about values is interesting as well, because values, we know that values are fundamental. You know, they're fundamentally important, but they also get a bad rep when they're applied in organizations, you know, but I think by well-meaning people who, you know, it's things like the values on the wall not necessarily representing what's really important to people. So when we talk about values, I think whether they're written on the wall or not, it's you know, you use the words, what really matters to us, and I think, like you say, if everyone's marching in the same direction, it's, you know, we've used the words around culture, you know, not being a cult.
Yeah.
But you know, if you start locking down exactly how everybody should behave, then you're starting to head in that direction.
Yeah, and
taking away that flexibility, that freedom to act.
Exactly. And how is the organization able to notice all the different perspectives out there and within the organization if it's not using the perspectives of the people within the organization? It's not that there is one lens, the CEO's lens, that tells everybody this is the perspective. Everyone's going to have their own connection with what the purpose of the organization is. Like, here's the wording of the purpose, but everyone's going to have their own sense of what that means to them and how they can contribute to it in a way that's meaningful for them.
Yeah, so we've touched on things like, you know, vision, strategy, values being important in organizational flexibility, but I guess that, you know, what about there's other things involved, and you know, what about things like structures and, you know, the harder aspects of the organization?
Yeah, and for me, context matters, that there isn't one defining rule of this is how all organizations should implement organizational flexibility. There's the way that I tend to think about it. Before I was talking about kind of checking in with where we are now and then what's the next step for doing what matters. Well, I think we can break that down quite a lot further. And so kind of the next layer down, I think of it as if we've trying to do what matters is kind of a core pillar that we've been talking about. Another core pillar is about our ability to notice different perspectives. So what have we got set up in the organization that helps us notice what evidence we have, notice different perspectives that people have, and which of those are useful for helping us to do what matters? And then this other pillar, the third pillar I think of, is around openness. And I think this is such a key piece, trying to help us to willingly acknowledge that that challenge inevitably comes with trying to figure out in this organization how we can notice the problems, surface those problems, be able to willingly see them, and find ways through that matter, and also to be willing to experiment to the degree that is possible within the organization. And again, that's going to be so contextual. I think quite a lot around job design in that kind of space, around openness, like to what extent can we try out different options? But that's going to be so different in different roles, different businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does link a little bit to a comment we've got, a question from Craig on LinkedIn, which is, we've been doing some work around the client around tolerance of ambiguity, this to sphere of influence to help address flexibility and pace issues. And Craig had welcome thoughts on that. So ambiguity and tolerance. And you said being open to, I think you used the word accepting, or was that my interpretation? Taking that on, however you look at it, that uncertainty, ambiguity, recognizing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really like that phrasing actually around tolerance to ambiguity. And there's different phrasing that I've used around this. In the original model, we were playing with the wording of openness to discomfort. And I think in a way that can be useful, but I also think that it can land in an unhelpful way as well, that we're not encouraging organizations to make things uncomfortable for people. It's much more of a willingness to acknowledge there will be problems, there will be challenges, there will be disagreements. How can we be open to noticing that? What behaviors are we reinforcing around that? And what behaviors are we maybe punishing? What are we ignoring that mean that those things aren't being surfaced? So I think the stuff that's happening around psychological safety plays in this area a lot. But I also have challenges with how that sometimes is landing in, the translation from academia into practice about, we're not trying to make the world so safe and secure that we're ending up doing the opposite of flexibility. We're getting back into that rigidity and control to make everything safe. So there's something in between, and actually kind of going back to what psychological safety is really about, that atmosphere, that climate for unearthing problems.
Yeah, and I mean that whole thing about ambiguity is an interesting one, isn't it? Because from my perspective around, from stuff like reversal theory, you tolerate ambiguity. In fact, you thrive in ambiguity when you seek freedom. But you used the word, reinforcing or punishing, essentially. And the challenge is that we make organizations very rule bound. And willingly or unwittingly we effectively reinforce that need to know, that need for everything to be crystal clear. What is my next step? How should I do this? What are the rules around this? and we also punish deviation from those rules. And it's not deliberate. It's been very much around the quest for efficiency and and standardization in the name of things like efficiency, isn't it? And it must be quite difficult for organizations to break out of that.
Well, absolutely. I think, it's natural for us as individuals, when we start something new, do something that's difficult, there's the sort of complexity, novelty, those kinds of things. It's hard at the beginning, and that takes mental effort, it takes emotional energy, it might take physical energy to do those things that are new. And then when we have got a bit of practice at it, that terrain becomes a bit smoother, and we might even find that we've got a bit of a habit, a bit of a groove going on, and now it feels a bit easier, and now there's a bit of relief there that we can follow our groove. The challenge then is to check in with ourselves that we're not getting into that rut or that trench and not looking up to see if there's a more effective way, whether the terrain has changed. And we do that as individuals, but there's this language that I've come across about collective collusion, unconscious collusion, that we do in organizations, that together we're essentially putting processes together to help us to get into that groove. That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It helps us to know what resources we need to get the same results as last time, and so that's is a real sense of security, that we're not just guessing that, what resources do we need? We know, we did it last time, we've got this groove. But if we get into that entrenched situation, we're not noticing, are we even doing what matters anymore? Did things change out there? Is there a better way? Is there another way? Does somebody else have another perspective? We can really miss out on all of that. But it feels safe in there for all of us. This isn't just something about some evil manager up there, the sort of scenarios we get our heads into, but this is for all of us. So as an employee, I know what's needed of me. I'm plowing down this tunnel.
Yeah, and processes can become I was going to say, make sure you use the right word here, crutch. Put the right vowel in there. Organization that I worked with for a very long time, or for me anyway, for a long time, it was very frustrating at times, because we were very process driven, very compliance driven, and that was okay sometimes, but it's frustrating to the point where people would say, "No, that's the process." Yeah, but the process isn't working. No, but that's the process, and people were so fixed around, yeah, but I'm following the process, therefore it's right. No, it's not getting us the right result, and you go around in circles, and even when people recognized it was difficult to change those things because of things like resource constraints, because of not being, this is where it gets interesting, because it's a lack of structure and clarity in certain areas. Like, how do I change something? So, process can be an aid to flexibility, because you say, I now understand how I would go about doing that, making that different. And, whereas if people don't know, they just stick with things that don't work. Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it? When we're in the trench imagery, we stop reinforcing behaviors that help us kind of see the benefit of changing and adapting, and those just the smallest of shifts. We know this process isn't working. What are the small things that we can do? What's the next step? And as individuals, great, what can we do? But also, what are we doing collectively that is reinforcing that? What are we saying? What's the message that we're giving? If we're ignoring the problems, that is what the culture is in the organization. So the culture is what we're reinforcing, what we're punishing, and what we're ignoring, what we're letting go through. And we're basically saying it's fine for things to not work in the short term and the long term.
I mean, and we've also both worked in we both worked in the startup world, and that, you know, we're a startup ourselves, and that's equally challenging when you don't have the guardrails. You haven't, you try, and each time you come across something, you're treating it as in a novel way, and so you're very flexible, but at the same time, it's not necessarily in a, you know, not necessarily in a helpful way. So there's, right, going back right to your very first point, there's that element of consistency, and that choice about being flexible is really important.
Yeah, I think that is so key as well, because I don't want to give the message that efficiency, reliability, processes are necessarily wrong. It's not about right or wrong. It's about being able to continue to check in with, is this still working now, given that our current context for doing what matters to us now? Because actually what matters can change. What the founders of the organization originally set it up for, the societal need that was being fulfilled, whatever that was, that might have adjusted. So does something need to change internally around that too? What else are we noticing? So I really like the language around right or wrong. I think if we can lighten the load on that and check in with ourselves about, and is this working, is quite important to me.
I just saw Craig's comment there, you can't sack me for following the process. That's where it becomes a comfort thing. So we talked about things like vision, you know, values, there's stuff around culture, but we talked around things like process, structure, all contributing in their own way to our organizational flexibility. But there's no, what I'm also picking up is there's no really hard and fast, you know, this is a recipe, as it were, blueprint for organizational flexibility. And I suppose that in many respects, you know, if there was a blueprint, then we'd be going back to not being flexible. You know?
Yeah, and so I do. I like to think more in terms of kind of principles or the skills and characteristics that we can try to reinforce around flexibility. But for me, behavior is always contextual. So I've been playing with this stuff about what's going on inside, what's going on outside. That comes with you wherever you're going, as the organization, all the people, and so it's what makes behavior effective is always relevant to that context, and so it's going to be different in different situations. Does that make sense? I don't know whether that came across.
It does. And I can also see why there could be people who listening to this, or people I know from my own past, many people I've worked within organizations and worked for, who would be going, look, I can't deal with this. I can't deal with this. I need to know.
Yeah.
I need to know what I need to do.
Yeah.
And I suppose you were socialized into that a little bit.
Yeah, and I love that. I think it's absolutely spot on. But I sometimes think the coaching analogy is quite useful here. So when we're coaching an individual, as a coach, I'm not going in there and saying, this is what you should be doing. I've got the answers for you. What I'm trying to help my coachee, my clients, think about is their other perspectives, other ways that they can look at things, but they've got the resources within them for them where they are now. What would be a helpful next step for them doing what matters for them? And so when I'm working with organizations, what I'm really trying to do is help them build those same kinds of skills so that they continue to notice. So it's almost like building in the processes of reinforcement for, are we noticing what matters? Are we reinforcing behaviors to elicit those problems and challenges and things like that?
And in my experience, you know, again, using sort of using reversal theory, and I'm not going to try and explain what that is to people, but it is this thing. But what it shows us is, if you can change, effectively see the same situation through a different lens, it fundamentally changes how you experience it. So it is all about perspective. It's all about noticing. It's all about being able to put a different lens on the problem, and then to be able to, you know, to deal with it differently as a result.
Yeah, and yet that's challenging, isn't it, Rob? Like, I think in organizations, when we're drawing on a diversity of perspectives, which is kind of the equivalent at that organizational level, it's almost like for an individual, it's the different perspectives are our thoughts, and for an organization, the different perspectives are different humans with their viewpoints. But having those different perspectives inevitably means disagreement. And that's another thing that we need to expect, the challenge of disagreement. And so are there ways that the organization is kind of rewarding healthy disagreement? And if it looks like it's maybe heading towards something that's more conflicting, what are the things that are in place that can help stop that getting out of hand, so that people feel like it's an all right place to go, that I have a different opinion?
Yeah, when we're doing, I remember doing some team building, stuff a few years back, and we were one of them, and it comes from the the Lencioni stuff, which some people like, some people don't like, but we talked about conflict norms, and and so as a team being able to have healthy conflict, because you knew how you were going to handle the conflict, you knew what you would lean on, what the process would be, if you like. And so again, it's those guardrails, isn't it? It's not about taking away all structure and stuff, to be flexible. So we talked, quite a while there, and in quite a roundabout way, about what it is, but why is it so important? I mean, what's the research telling us about organizational flexibility? I mean, we can relate to it in a real life kind of setting. Things are changing out there. There is volatility, all that sort of stuff. So we see why we would need to be flexible, but what do we know about organizational flexibility and its benefits?
Yeah, lovely question. Thanks, Rob. So I think, first off, I'm going to frame this in that there's been decades of really rigorous research around psychological flexibility. So lots of RCTs, randomized controlled trials across contexts, a lot in the therapeutic context, but also to high performance sports and leadership. So across contexts. So there's that context word again, that across situations, we know that psychological flexibility is useful for our effectiveness and health. And this model of organizational flexibility is based on this and is still relatively new. It's drawing on so much organizational behavior research, as well as psychological flexibility research, but essentially mine has been the first empirical research, so going out there and actually working with organizations. And so early days, we might like to call it cutting edge, but just wanting to put that caveat out there. But the initial evidence is really, really promising. So at the organizational level, we're seeing that organizational flexibility predicts organizational performance, the perspectives of organizational performance. Yeah. And we're also seeing, though, that this interesting piece at the individual level. So if I perceive my organization to be behaving flexibly, so if I see that that's how it is, that is helping with my mental health, with my job satisfaction, with my intrinsic work motivation. So that is such a fascinating piece for me, and that is working over and above my own psychological flexibility. So even with these years of research on psychological flexibility, this is really showing that the context matters, like we didn't know, but that organizational environment is so important.
Okay. And I mean, I think in your, I was looking at your research brief, you talked about things like employee engagement. What can you say about that?
Yeah, well, I think for me, employee engagement is going to be, is so much about how the employee is engaging with what matters to them and the organizational aims. Are they able to see themselves and what matters to them in the goals of the organization? Are they able to put themselves in that situation? And so I really feel like, in a way, this is speaking to that quite directly, and that I think there's sometimes when we talk about employee engagement, there's that, if we're overly engaged? Are we leading to burnout? But then we're trying to notice the discomfort. We're trying to air some of that, to, which can be preventative too.
Yeah, I mean, what the question and answer kind of ultimately kind of, I guess, point to is we have this ongoing definitional problem with employee engagement, and
yes.
and my issue with employee engagement is it is what I would describe as sort of motivationally narrow as a construct. So it is basically, are you committed to the organization, and are you being enthusiastic? And that has an implicit sort of conformity around it, and whereas that flexibility piece suggests that we might need to think about engagement in different ways. You know, am I asking the right questions of people? Am I challenging the way we do things? Those, you know, when you look at, you know, a scale, an organizational, you know, an employee engagement scale, these things don't show up. and so you can see the challenge here in many respects.
Yeah, I totally think so. And I'm going to go back to this point about discomfort as well. You know, when we're doing things that are important to us, you know, for me, I might think about my from a less work context, but, you know, from my health, I might think that going running is useful. So I set myself a goal of doing a 10K or a half marathon. Getting off the sofa, there's some discomfort in that, and the thoughts of, God, I'm unfit, people are going to see me out there sweating, puffing around. So, you know, if we think about that in the organizational context, there's a lot of stuff that really matters, and we get lots of social reinforcement from those around us when we're succeeding. But it's, some of this stuff is a real struggle, trying to meet goals, deadlines, trying to achieve. It can be really hard. Yeah. And so when we're surveying people about, are you happy? Well, not always. Doing stuff that matters sometimes is really, really tough. But the overall satisfaction when I do that 10K, God, I feel proud of myself afterwards, and I'm glad I put the effort in. And the same way as in the workplace, we can be so grateful that we were all in this together and we got through this, and look what we've achieved. So it's in the moment we're maybe uncomfortable, not loving it, maybe experiencing unwanted feelings, but overall, look at what we're doing.
Yeah, it's that, you know, instant versus delayed gratification, essentially, isn't it? There's some short-term pain for long-term gain and all that sort of stuff. But I don't know, is it something that is, you know, becoming more, you know, we're losing as a society? It's a bigger question than we can necessarily answer. But you know, but there is a bit of a tendency for us to want to be happy all the time.
Yeah, and I think when we're not, can we support each other with that? So again, this is kind of this willingness to acknowledge is the piece that's really important. So if I'm struggling, just being able to say, hey guys, I'm struggling. I'm trying, this is what I'm trying to do, but, you know, I need your support on this. I need you to know that I've got other stuff going on in my life. This is hard right now. Just having that, the support from people around that can help with that ongoing motivation, that I can experience uncomfortable feelings and it's still all right. Yeah,
absolutely. Philip has made the comment, you know, perhaps we need to be open to a more flexible definition of employee engagement. I completely agree. I think I would love to, I would love to be doing, you know, involved in that and doing that work. What we do is we kind of talk about going to our clients about going beyond engagement. Think about what's important to you as an organization now. Okay, it might be something like engagement, but what does engagement mean to you here and now? What would engaged people be doing? What would they, you know, how would they be behaving? What would you expect them to want? And then we also talk about we talk much more about the experience. So, you know, so our framework is very focused on the experiences that people are having rather than how engaged and rah rah. They are, even though our clients, often want to see that. So that, I suppose, that leads us into that, like, a question really about, a lot of our audiences, obviously HR and people, because of who we are and what we do, people are interested in the people experience, the employee experience. What would you suggest that they're doing in terms of the experiences they create, the conditions, the environment they provide to promote organizational flexibility?
I'm going to go back to my kind of 3 pillars. So what is being reinforced around doing what matters? So great, there's maybe some communications that happen sporadically around what our purpose is, but actually what is being reinforced and rewarded about people actually taking action in line with that? How are they connecting the kind of the how with the why? Like, what is it that is kind of joining the dots? And I don't think us as organizations are always very good about rewarding that necessarily. And I don't necessarily mean financial reward, though, also, but what are we doing? So I think
that recognize what,
so I think that's really key. Again, these kind of, what are we doing to acknowledge that, acknowledge difficulties, that willingness to unearth problems, what's being reinforced around that, what's in place around disagreement and conflict. There's a lovely phrase around trust, because I think trust is super important here. And trust can sound quite passive at times, but an active component that a colleague of mine, Paul Atkins, talked about was richly rewarding vulnerability. And I love that. So if I'm expressing, hey, I'm struggling right now, that's my vulnerability. How is that being rewarded? Again, not financially necessarily, but the kind of, it's okay to say that kind of acknowledgement.
Absolutely,
So and this kind of openness, so playing with job crafting ideas, open to playing with those different perspectives, helping people to bring themselves to their job.
And for people that aren't aware, our last webinar was on job crafting, and that will be on YouTube along with this.
Yeah, that was such a great conversation. I was like, I want to be in this as well. Yeah, definitely go back and listen to that conversation with Tailored Thinking. I think Rob's great.
Yeah. Okay. And all this stuff. Did you say all 3? Yeah. You gave all 3 there.
Yeah, I guess just that sort of a central piece around noticing, kind of making sure that we're getting in that diversity of perspectives, bringing in some evidence-based thinking. So what has worked? Will it work in this context? Like, what do we know about that? Those kinds of ideas as well.
And as you describe these things, I'm sitting there going, that's hard. It's hard for managers who have been developed to manage stuff. Yeah. What does it mean to manage? Well, to manage means to be in control. So it's tough, right?
It so is. And so what do? We go into our dredge. Like we know that flexibility is hard. That's why it needs to be embedded in the processes of flexibility, as reinforcing the understanding of challenge.
Well, it means a real shift for the role potentially of managers and things, but also that whole thing about, and this is where we come full circle. That whole thing about flexibility means not abandoning everything that you've ever known.
What's the next small step? Like, from you, in your perspective, in your organization, what's the next small step?
Yeah, I love that message as well. I love that message, because I think when you combine that with having a clear vision and purpose, this is where we're headed. Helping people to understand that the next step is, it's okay, take that next step. Then you'll know what the next step is. And then you'll know what the next step is. We can't, the world is just different now. We can't know what every step is towards that vision.
That doesn't mean we can't plan. we can plan, but also we need to anticipate that there will be problems and challenges and constraints that we have never anticipated.
It was Mike Tyson who says everybody has a plan till they get punched in the face. But it doesn't mean they shouldn't have had one in the first place.
Yes.
So, I mean, this has been really interesting for me. Does anybody, do we have any questions, coming in from the audience? And while that, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think is really important to get across?
I feel like we've covered lots of juicy, meaty areas there, Rob. Obviously, I could also talk about this endlessly, so it's a dangerous one to bring up.
Yeah. Try not to fall into that trap and keep a bit of an eye on the clock. So I find it fascinating. We'll just give it a minute, see if anybody does, if there are any questions. Okay, well, it looks like not. So it really just it just leaves me to say thank you to everybody who has. Oh, did you get one? I think I haven't seen your question. Did you want to retype that in here?
I can see Anne's question.
Oh, okay.
She says she agrees with everything I say. Well, hurrah. How do you think this approach works in, e.g., tech startup cultures and in the current hybrid working environment where cultures cohere in different ways to corporate cultures? Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'm going to say, because this behavior is embedded in whatever the context is, it's going to look different in different places. So in a tech startup, right at the beginning, startups tend to be pretty flexible. Like there's so much of it is that experimental nature anyway. Does this work? Does this work? Should we do more of this? Should we put the process in place around that? Because that seems to be working. And I think this is what tends to happen when we start to get to scale, that there's the great, now we need to proceduralize everything. Yeah. And then we're maybe not necessarily noticing the context as much. What's happening around us? What are the different perspectives that new people are bringing into this organization that might mean that there's something changing here? So yeah, I think how this stuff is embedded is going to look different at that stage to how it looks when we're talking about a multinational.
When you look at the stuff around organizational agility, which is slightly different, albeit similar, what is some of the stuff I've seen around that is legacy, more traditional organizations need to learn to build the flexibility in order to be agile, whereas startups start with the flexibility, but they actually need to build the structure in to become more agile.
Yeah.
So like I said, that thing about not knowing how to change something, not knowing how to respond to that. So having some process, having some guardrails and things is becomes important to that.
And what can we do as we build in those processes to also build in the noticing? Yeah. So that as part of that getting into the groove, what are the kind of stopping points that mean that we're actually looking up and around to see if this is still the healthy groove to be in?
Yeah. And then Anne says, I found that these organizations get better loyalty, engagement, and flexibility and success, where a wide range of behaviors and ability to deal with conflict is a natural part of life. I think that, I think that's often true, particularly in the ones that actually succeed. And I suppose what we don't necessarily see is the startups that fall by the wayside, and they perhaps don't get to grips with how to do that in a healthy way.
Yeah.
I think there was also another comment. I'm trying to find my mouse here.
See if
my cursor. There was another comment. Oh, I thought.
Yeah, from Craig.
Oh, yeah, from Craig. Is there a balance of leadership, management, supervising, and then organizations' expectations on that?
I think there's such a powerful piece that we need to explore on leaders in general. And so for me, when I think about leadership, I think about there being kind of 3 areas of flexibility that we need to consider. So what is the leader doing for themselves in terms of their own psychological flexibility? You know, the whole, you know, put the mask on first yourself. You know what I'm trying to say in the aeroplane scenario.
Look after yourself so you can look after other people.
Yes, exactly. So helping leaders with their own psychological flexibility, but also then what are the behaviors that they're role modeling? What are they doing to help reinforce the psychological flexibility of their employees? And how are they reinforcing the organizational flexibility behaviors? So I'm not pretending that that's easy, but trying to think of it in those 3 ways, I think is quite a useful starting point, recognizing, unearthing, acknowledging that that is the challenge. I think that's cool from managers, leaders.
I mean, we know that middle managers in particular get a bad rep, and first line managers are, often it's a very difficult step to make. And I think the biggest thing we could probably do is cut people a little bit of slack in that sense. And it's that stuff. It's not cutting people a bit of slack. It's about that monitoring of performance and constant checking of, are you meeting expectations that stops us noticing?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, there's another new message before I was about to say. So that's in. Is there any evidence? So from Isabella, is there any evidence that organisations practicing flexibility have better employee engagement ratios? I guess scores and things.
I wasn't looking specifically at employee engagement in my research. I was looking at job satisfaction, and both at an individual levels. So if I perceive my organisation to be behaving flexibly, I am more likely to be satisfied in my job. But I was also seeing that at the collective level. So organizational flexibility seemed to predict collective job satisfaction. So that seemed to be like that holistic piece. We did see a bit around intrinsic work motivation as well, but that was much more at the individual level. Interestingly, I didn't see evidence of collective work motivation in my research. It didn't feel like there was any particular organization which had kind of consensus around motivation, which maybe makes sense. It's intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, I mean, intrinsic motivation is very, very close to a lot of definitions of employee engagement.
Yeah.
Anyway, isn't it? Ultimately, being willing to do something for its own sake and feeling good about what you're doing. Okay, look, that's great. You've some really good questions there. So
yeah, lovely stuff.
I'll go back to where I was and say, look, thanks to everybody for joining in, for participating, for asking great questions, for being with us today, and thank you very much, Annie, for joining us. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been such a pleasure. Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks for everyone for your great questions.
Oh, and how can people find you?
I have just set up a new website finally, which is www.anniegascoigne.com. So you can hopefully find me quite easily, and there's some resources there, and you can get in touch through the website.
Awesome. Great.